flexibility.
Hi, everyone. Bob Kolasky. I'm a Senior Vice President at Exiger. I work on supply chain risk issues at Exiger. Have a lot of background in critical infrastructure, CISA and other places. I'm thinking about kind of systemic risk to critical infrastructure. And what I'm presenting on today is a view of some work I'm doing right now with the Carnegie Endowment and International Peace with some colleagues on how the nature of the development of artificial intelligence is going to change what is critical infrastructure and some of the critical infrastructure resilience challenges, and perhaps shift where systemic risk lies and give us some opportunity to develop some new resilience-enabled strategies. You were making a joke about OWL or AI, right? It is easy to come up here and give a talk about artificial intelligence. What I am talking about as it relates to artificial intelligence, just to be perfectly clear, is the infrastructure that artificial intelligence depends on. And the reason that we care about the infrastructure that artificial intelligence depends on, among other things, is because artificial intelligence is being embedded in the operations of infrastructure. And so if we're having a conference here about critical effects and strategic risks to critical infrastructure, making sure that the risks to AI operations don't further exacerbate the risks to critical infrastructure. And then on the other side, that artificial intelligence can be of value toward critical infrastructure operations. I'm very much thinking about this from a resilience and safety perspective, not necessarily a security, the security parts of the challenge related to artificial intelligence. I want to lay that out. And so, hopefully that will clarify a little bit as I get going, and as we continue to talk, you'll see kind of the focus of our area, of our work. So right now, we all understand that the build out of artificial intelligence and the compute power necessary, in this case, artificial intelligence, of course, is using data to drive decision makings at the speed of, at hyperspeed with an artificial algorithm that creates the ability to exploit data to make more effective decisions. And that depends on a lot of computing power. But of course, computing power sits, through the development of the chips and cloud service providers and the energy and water demands that it takes to operate all this infrastructure. And so we see a surging demand because of artificial intelligence on our critical infrastructure. We see critical infrastructure that is being operated in a mix of physical and digital ways. We've been talking about that at this conference for a long time, the convergence between physical and digital, but certainly in the delivery of artificial intelligence, we are past the point of convergence. We are converged. The headline of the slide, that the capital and the development and the build out and the use of artificial intelligence is outpacing the policy attention and policy demand. But we are seeing both the incredible surge in capex and investment in development of artificial intelligence and the underlying infrastructure at the same time that there is a rising policy attention. The debates here in DC have recently tended to be about cybersecurity and the vulnerability management and aspects of how you manage control of the actual large language models themselves and what they can do. But there's also a lot of other elements of artificial intelligence that are getting policy attention. Certainly around the country, you see a lot of pushback on the idea of data centers and build out of infrastructure in different regions and a demand for some level of safety as the artificial intelligence gets deployed. We're also seeing stress on supply chains. So that's the conditions we live in. There's a lot of pressures that make it hard to make smart resilience and risk management decisions because of that. And I think my argument is that it's really important that we, and I don't think that's controversial, that we do make smart resilience and risk management decisions at this stage, because we're seeing a build out where we can either layer on resilience at the beginning or we can deal with the consequences of not having that resilience. So to step back a second, on this slide, this is an overview of our preliminary research on where artificial intelligence is already becoming load-bearing in the operations of critical infrastructure sectors. Load-bearing, is a nice model in the sense that if something is load-bearing, it is the operations of the infrastructure itself are dependent on artificial intelligence functioning. So here on this chart, we have a little bit across some critical sectors: energy and utilities, telecommunications, cloud computing, transportation, et cetera. We have an assessment of the current level of adoption in the sectors and the degree of operational dependence. And you see in areas like telecommunications and cloud service providers already a fairly high level, if not a very high level, of operational dependence. The same thing might be said in a sector that's not on this slide, the financial sector, related to that. So we're already seeing, and then there are other areas, we've spent a lot of time at this conference talking about water and wastewater. At this point, the degree of operational dependence on artificial intelligence is relatively low. The current AI adoption is relatively low there. In manufacturing, it's higher there. And what this all means, and we've got some representative use cases up there, but what this all means is for infrastructure to operate, artificial intelligence and the digital use of artificial intelligence is changing the nature of the infrastructure operations. There's long been this idea that you can go back from digital operations to analog, but as you continue to increase the dependence on artificial intelligence, I think that idea is going to go further and further away, and it's going to be difficult to operate infrastructure systems the way they're currently operated with an analog backup. Pretty soon it's going to be difficult to operate even with men in the middle of decision-making processes or humans in the loop of decision-making processes. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That's just a reality. And in fact, the adoption of artificial intelligence to deliver core critical functions is going to improve the ability to deliver those core critical functions. And so I have no doubt that the cost-efficient uses of resources and the optimization and the building into preferences and addressing hazards that might emerge and anticipation and making trade-off decisions in the operation of infrastructure is going to be improved by artificial intelligence. But of course, it's going to be if that's the case, it's going to rely on artificial intelligence. And if the underlying infrastructure that supports that artificial intelligence is not available, we have a problem, and we may have created some systemic risk. So when I talk about the underlying infrastructure here, here's a visual depiction of it. At the top of the AI infrastructure stack is the AI operations layer. That's what we all see when we think about AI, large language models, agentic use of AI, enterprise AI in workplaces, the kind of infrastructure organizations I was just talking about, to allow for decision support. And so there's the AI operations layer, but underpinning the AI operations layer is all this other stuff that is in essence, the critical functioning for the infrastructure, for the AI itself, the algorithms, data management. So can you have the data? Can you train the data? Where do you store the data? How do you build algorithms related to that? That work is largely still done by the companies that we most associate with AI. But then from there, below that is the actual data processing points, the data holding, the networking, the compute power that goes on, and the data centers are, of course, the manifestation of that. And then for that all to work, you need the hardware, software, the semiconductors, GPUs, operational technology, IT systems, industrial control systems to allow the data centers to function. And for all that to work is the foundational infrastructure that we've traditionally called the most critical functioning: energy, telecommunications, fuel, critical minerals, water. All that helps the execution of the availability of AI to support infrastructure operations. So each of these layers, in essence, becomes part of the critical infrastructure for the world that we are building. None of this, not all of this perhaps is new to what it has been critical infrastructure, but how you think about these layers and how we consider this stack in the organizations and the way that the functions are created, that needs to be built into our critical infrastructure planning. And that's a realization that we've come to. Here are some statistics that highlight some of the pace of the build out and the pressures that have been put on infrastructure. Electricity demand, US data centers could consume as much as 17% of total US electricity generation by 2030. That's up from roughly 4%. So we're seeing a surge in energy demand and electricity demand. We're seeing a surge in the data centers from a building out the infrastructure, supply chain requirements as it relates to chips and components and transformers, cooling, new pressures on water. Water availability is already a concern, but data centers will add to the concern, and that there's land use and geographical concentration. So we're building out this whole new critical infrastructure. And I'll stop and take any questions if anyone has along the way.
I do.
Yeah.
So is there any sort of perspective of, I'm not sure what the right word is, but if you lose electricity, the effects are immediate. If you lose telecom, it takes a little longer, but it's But if you lose finance, it'll be like a week or something like that, right? So where would you see the loss of this load in terms of load bearing? It seems like this would take some time before the effects are felt. Is that true, or have you accounted for that at all?
So in terms of load bearing, we've seen, and one of the things we're doing is looking at incidents that have had systemic impacts. And, I was here earlier when Manish were talking, and we're talking about CrowdStrike, and we're talking about an AWS outage, and we're talking, so data center outages that, we've seen in Canada, cloud service provider outage with the Rogers Telecom things. And what you see is so the immediate effects are when there's an availability, lack of availability for the data processing and the availability of the data itself to operate the large language models and the underlying AI. So that's the first order thing that you need to be concerned about, whether you lose operational availability of things like that. Understanding the degree to which stress on electrical systems, the natural disasters, a potential electoral event like a geomagnetic disturbance, do we have resilience built in for rollover against those sort of scenarios? So we're trying to work through that.
Yeah, it wasn't so much whether you have rollover. It's just more of the effects won't be felt for it's not, the effects aren't felt as quickly as electricity. And maybe in another way is that if Facebook and WhatsApp went down, I think a lot of us would cheer.
Yes.
If AI went down, I don't know if many people would shed a tear, so to speak. But the perspective is generally like it won't be. The effects are not for the operational use cases that you had there. Are you suggesting that?
We're suggesting that as we move forward, there'll be less ability to roll over backwards to analog backup and to be able to operate systems without the compute power necessary of artificial intelligence.
So you are suggesting that the effects will be felt immediately?
Yes, and that we need to account for the possibility that the effects will be felt immediately. And so part of this is to study the elements that, an incident like that can cause systemic failures of operations of infrastructure. And we're worried that that's the case.
Okay, all right. Any other questions that people had for Bob while we have a break? Proceed.
So let me go to them. So the problem here that we're trying to get to is an understanding by which we have a sense of the question you just asked about the degree to which can withstand certain hazards because of the conditions that have been created in the build out. So, traditionally you need resilience is the ability to withstand, absorb, and recover against an incident occurring. We've created closely coupled systems that are highly reliant on artificial intelligence, and we will continue to go in that path. And we done the planning for the scenarios by which there's failures of a data centers, the failures of a swath of data centers, lack of availability of the energy and the water to underline the infrastructure. And so we are trying to think through kind of how do you take a step back and do the kind of resilience planning that needs to be happened as part of the infrastructure build out when incentives favor speed over robustness. There's somewhat of a limited system-wide visibility. There's fragmented governance of this challenge, and there's shifting political dynamics. AI itself is not particularly popular as the rollout, and there is, if you look at the studies there, and therefore there isn't perhaps a regulatory path to make sure we have a sufficient resilience put in place for the system to withstand disaster. And as I think most of us come to understand, that resilience is not just a technical problem, but it's also an incentive and governance problem. And currently the incentives and governance to do effective management of the AI build out and building resilience aren't there right now. So looking at a swath of potential resilience, wanted to focus on the things we can do here, categories of resilience enabling strategies. And we've come up with a set of 6 resilience enabling strategies that have been put in place for other challenges as we've built up safety and security, but need to be thought of right now as we support and understand the system-wide build out of infrastructure to support AI. And, I would divide these 6 resilience strategies into 3 soft three candidate soft strategies and three candidate hard strategies. On the soft side, is there enough visibility and transparency of how the infrastructure stack operates, and potential incidents, whether they're man-made or failure incidents, so that we have a better sense of how close and how strong the system is when incidents do occur. We've seen this with CSP incidents and the like. So creating more visibility and transparency, creating more anticipation planning and preparedness, and building out structures to do more anticipation planning and preparedness, and to stress test the system against the kind of scenarios that could cause failure, and what are the gaps that then get filled by lessons learned and exercises and the like. Are there structures in place? Currently, there really aren't structures in place that effectively think through the technological aspects of AI failure from a coordination, operations, communications perspective, and then a set of hard resilient strategies, building secure and resilient designs, redundancy, diversity, and fallover, dependency reduction, and resource efficiency. So to try to innovate to create more resilience into the system, and what techniques need to be put in place around there. So, thinking through for this challenge set, the problems, the opportunities within the soft resilient strategies and the hard resilient strategies to strengthen the safety of the data center environment, the security of the data center environment, the resource use of energy and water and communications that are necessary to operate the environment, the degree to which there's an interconnectivity there, the stakeholders, the public safety aspects of some of the potential failures there, getting people at the table through an operations coordination, and getting visibility to plan for scenarios that will stress test the AI infrastructure. That's what we need to build toward. And then to do that, we need to have the structures and incentives in place to allow for that to be built toward. We need to think through what regulatory mechanisms are gaps in our current approach to how much risk that's being created. Are there market forces that will enhance and incentivize additional resilience, whether those are contract market forces, insurance market forces, customer focus there to adopt standards toward a higher level resilience? What kind of standards can be built via voluntary frameworks? Should this problem be thought of from an international level? Other OECD countries certainly are dealing with aspects of this. And, can we put in smart regulations to augment the things that are going to happen naturally to build in a stronger system overall? And the system itself is smart system design, operations, and governance and incentives. And the problem set here is that we don't know that, as the future builds out and AI becomes more important for infrastructure, as I said at the beginning, and there are new stresses on infrastructure, we currently don't have a process in place where we're going to be able to stress test effectively the amount of systemic risk that's been created. I pointed out some of the gaps that hopefully the resilience enabling strategies can help build toward. And as we think through the challenge of stress testing against this new AI environment, what are the levers that we could put in place to promote system-wide resilience enabling strategies? That's really right now where our research is lying. We've sat here at different stages of technology build-outs where we know we're going to have a more interconnected system that depends on technology that's not fully well understood. And what we need to do at those moments is understand the safety considerations, the degree to which risk sits across a system that nobody has sole responsibility against, the impact on vulnerable populations potentially who don't have any ability to influence the decisions that are made or don't have a strong ability to influence the decisions that are made, but certainly will bear some of the costs related to that. And as we create a more coupled system, because of artificial intelligence, we are going to create an environment in which failure is not well understood, and the kind of strategic world of strategic risk that we live in right now means that failure could become a significant problem. And I'd like to see us make some commitment to building the structures and information sets to have a better sense of what that risk looks like, who's got a seat at the table, and start to work through responsibilities to elevate the level of resilience. And so I hope the set of resilience enabling strategies, give us a path to consider things that have worked in certain environments, have worked less in other environments, and try to apply those solutions in a structured way to the systemic nature of this problem and look for levers to make those things adoptable. And so as we continue this work, I wanted to present this as we're sort of midway through the way we're thinking about that to get some feedback. And as we continue it, come through with a candidate list of resilience enabling strategies that the community can center around so that we can promote things that will allow us to be more resilient to the world we're creating rather than to have a resiliency gap. Thank you.
Okay, any questions? Oh, start with you.
Thanks, Suzanne.
Given today's current market incentives for these companies to just go big and go fast, what are some incentives you've thought through that would push them to think more about resilience and continuity?
So, I mean, to me, the number one set of incentives is around the idea of safety of deployment of technology. And I'm a big fan of the Hori analogy of, you put brakes in not because you want to go fast or not because you want to go slower there. And so how do you think from an incentive perspective about things that will make sure that there's not going to be harm to communities around safety considerations? And so I think tying resilience recommendations, in this case, less to security, more to safety, is a way to go. In terms of the actual incentives, whether it's sort of market incentives of a standard that needs to be put in place, and what does it mean for a standard to be put in place, and for data centers developments, like where I'm aware works that the Telecom Industry Association is doing on quality standards for data centers, and you would hope that some of that would push over to contracts and customer selection. And then for the big players, the other part of this conversation is we are heading in the world, I call it the data center politics, of all of this being less and less popular at the community level. And so how can you communicate resilience as something that is a strength to the community? And that goes back to some of the infrastructure operations, that it's going to make your life better if we can build out these things, but we'll do it in a way that is safe and resilient. That's the framing. The particular incentives become, at what point does somebody feel enough pressure that they need to put the brake in? And, some of that may come with requirements. So that's how to think about
it. So Bob, one of your collaborators at CIP, Ellie, did a lot of great work on cloud.
Yes.
Right. And I hear this and I'm like, okay, how much of this is basically resurfacing some of that, but saying you thought you were relying on the cloud and people did, and there's some degree of there's some degree of reliance there that wasn't fully mapped, and things could go down and things are breaking, and now you're turning that up to 11 and saying like, hey, sectors that were only moderately or not, would score low on cloud reliance, score actually pretty high on AI reliance, and it's heading in that direction. Then sectors that were already like, yeah, you probably care a lot about cloud, are now like, you're dead if you lose access to AI. So is that like a good, quick framing of this, or is there something else beyond how the earlier systemic risk stuff?
So thanks for referencing that. And I helped Ellie a little bit with that project. So we published a study 2 years ago, the Cloud Reassurance Project, related to that, and within Carnegie, that this is a continuation of that. I think the nature here is the infrastructure challenge, and even in that case, is broader than what sits in the CSP's ability to manage. And so when we're talking about cloud reassurance, and then just reassurance of, again, the underlying compute that needs AI, we're trying to note everyone that needs to be part of the process. You need to have the supply chain, you need to have the energy and the power, so that you have the ability to operate. So it brings more of the dependencies into things. And then to your point, the AI build out part of it just continues to increase the reliance on the critical aspects of this. And, bringing back the question earlier is like, at what point do we think the breaking of the operations cloud service providers actually starts to have systemic impacts on the operations, and how has artificial intelligence changed that? And so those are some of the things we're trying to extend the work into.
So on one of your slides, you referred to AI enabling infrastructure and systemic risk. And I recall from my time in government services, when we were talking about systemic risk, a lot of pushback, especially from providers of that enabling infrastructure, that they don't necessarily view themselves as contributing to systemic risk, or they don't see systemic risk. I mention that because I'm questioning, to make progress on this, how much do you think it relies on those providers acknowledging or accepting the role that they play to drive for this level of resilience?
So what's interesting about systemic risk as a concept, right, is the risk sits across a system, and there are important elements within that a failure creates the systemic risk. And learning from the providers as to whether they think they contribute to systemic risk is worthwhile, having that discussion, trying to map out the scenarios that are systemic risk means systemic consequences. There are systemic consequences. If they are part of the load-bearing aspects that can lead to systemic consequences, and they own some responsibility for the systemic risk. I would argue that objectively, if you can prove that, that is true. What responsibilities they own for mitigating that systemic risk is a conversation you have by understanding the system and where the system goes, and the kind of incentive conversation and requirements there. And so, I tend to be a little bit of a purist in the idea that the risk is what the risk is. And part of the risk here is the uncertainty related to that. And so there are elements of that, and you don't get to decide whether you created systemic risk. You can argue over what your role is in addressing the systemic risk. So you seem skeptical.
I mean, I hear you, but I think it's it kind of buys time, right? How proactive it is when they buy into it, or are incentivized. I think it's got incentivized to do it in that facility to their aspect, versus after the fact when it's clear you contributing to it and then you have to.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the dilemma in why getting in front of these things without evidence of systemic failure is difficult. Going back to anticipation, planning, preparedness, and visibility, transparency, and polling from certain incidents. Concentration risk does by itself produce higher potential for systemic risk. Concentration risk is certainly easier to prove around here. Uncertainty and lack of understanding about the use of certain technologies also creates risk. That's easier to prove. So start to narrow down the things that are where the actual debate lies on, and whether the degree of the system's at risk. That's one way to think. Yeah.
Hi, Brad. Thanks for taking the time to speak with us today. I'm curious, if you were back in the building at CISA, what would be your number one priority of thing to tackle? And then what do you think they're doing well inside the building, and where do you think they need to course correct?
About this problem?
Let's scope into this problem.
Yes. My general frame is the critical functions that, so when I hear Nick this morning talking about the things that are most critical for the operations of things you care about is a good framing. So starting with either AI or in general, like having that ruthless prioritization conversation, we can have a debate over, is it defense critical infrastructure, is it healthcare, is it whatever? But that's a debate that is sort of your view on, you bring the best available information, and then your view on policy preferences in terms of what the most important role is. So I think they're doing well. What I'd like to see through this project and other things is the consistent structures to get the right players. And so if you look at the infrastructure stack, I'm not sure we've got everyone at the table who needs to be at the table to think through the AI build out for here. So make sure that there's a consistent cross-sector way to coordinate the entities that are involved in this. that they're brought into the planning conversations to surface some of these risk issues, and that there's the trust necessary to have conversations. And so I'm not sure, I definitely feel like with the lack of the CPAC framework and the robust use of coordinating councils, we suffer from a lack of consistent coordination methods, and I'll let other people talk about that. And then I don't think the evolution of what is critical infrastructure has caught up with the actual process of we think of critical infrastructure. So I worry sometimes that we're missing the conversations with the right people, or CISA is missing the conversations with the right people.
Okay. All right. Bob, thanks very much.
Thanks.
I want to talk to you about this more later.
Yeah.
All right, Andrew. Andrew, you're Andrew. Okay.